So I don't know if you've ever noticed this before, but the bad decisions that we often make in life involve the voices of others. I don't know if you've ever seen that before, but the voices of others often influence us, whether it was a spring break that you went on, or whether it was a party that you went to, or a relationship you said yes to, or maybe a relationship that you said no to. The chances are that there was the voice of someone else who was speaking to you in that moment, or the voice of multiple people who were speaking to you. Often the voices or the experiences we have in life that lead us to the greatest amount of regret had other voices speaking into us. I was thinking about my own life, and the story of regret, a story that I'm able to share with you today, involved the voices of others when I was a high school student. And chances are, you know that in high school we make some bad decisions. And I had a friend, his name was Nick. Nick is a pastor now too, which is kind of funny, right? That he and I have both chosen similar paths in life. But one day we were driving in Nick's car. We lived kind of out in the wilderness, or we were in a country area. And so as we were driving, we realized that we had fireworks in the car. And we're high school students because, high school students know everything, and we had lots of good ideas. And we began thinking to ourselves, wow, we've got these fireworks in the car. Wouldn't it be fun if we used the cigarette lighter in the car? Because this was back in the day when they made cigarette lighters in cars. Wouldn't it be fun if we lit the fireworks and threw them out the window as we're driving around? Now, there was a certain firework that we had that was called a jumping jack. I don't know if anybody knows what a jumping jack is. They're really not that exciting in their normal form. You just light them and throw them on the ground, and they jump around because sparks fly out the side of them. But because I was a high schooler and I knew everything, I had discovered that if you light the jumping jacks and throw them in the air, it's like an uncontrolled rocket. I mean, it just goes all over the place, and you don't know where it's going to go, and it adds, a little bit of chaos and excitement to the equation. And so Nick and I, as we're driving in these country roads, knowing everything that we knew as high school students, we thought it would be a great idea to light these jumping jacks with a cigarette lighter and throw them out the car window, because nothing could go wrong with that, right? Yeah. And so there we were throwing our jumping jacks out the window in the country, and all of a sudden something did go wrong with that. And I think it was Nick, I don't remember for sure, but I think it was Nick who threw it, and it hit the window of the car and then bounced back in. Now, because we were high school students and knew everything, we had our seatbelts on, right? Because that's what you're supposed to do. That's what we were taught from a young age. And so all of a sudden, we're strapped into this car where a live firework starts going off. And we weren't really sure what was going to happen. Thankfully, it just burned a hole in his seat, and it was his seat, not mine. I didn't have to tell my parents about the whole excursion. But the thing is, if we had listened to other voices, if we had listened to other voices and what other people, voices of wisdom, I think we might have made different decisions, and we would have been saved from some regret. The thing about the bad decisions that we make, so often they're influenced by other people, the voices of other people, and if we had listened to different voices, we would be better off. Now, I tell you all that because we're in this middle of this series that's called Voices, and we've been talking about the different voices that play into us. We've been talking about how voices are so very powerful in our lives. Voices are so very powerful, and one of the beautifully complicated things about humanity is that we all have a voice, right? I mean, we all have a voice. We all want to use our voice. We all want people to listen to our voice. We've all had voices that have spoken to us. Most of us have recordings of voices that are playing through our minds, sometimes that are encouraging to us. Sometimes they're discouraging. Frankly, more often, they're voices that are discouraging, that are playing over and over and over. And so throughout this series over the last 3 weeks, we've really just been talking about what do we do with our voice, and what do we do with the voices that we've been hearing? So if you missed any of these, we'd love for you to go to our website, icommunitychurch.com. You can catch up on everything that we've been talking about. And actually, we have video on there now, too, so you can watch if you're into that. Now, today, in honor of our students who are kind of finishing school, right, or some are graduating, some are moving on in life, some have already finished school, I want to take some time to talk about the voices that influence us. The voices that influence us, because I think there's some important lessons, and it's not just for the young people in the room, just so you know, there will be some good application for all age groups, but particularly for those of you who are younger in the room, I want to invite you to pay really close attention today, because we've got some really, I hope, helpful stuff for you as you kind of enter another stage of life and move on in life. The truth is, everybody is influenced by the voice of somebody, right? And often it's more than one voice. Everybody's influenced by the voice of somebody. And it really begs the question of which voices influence you? Which voices influence you? I don't know if you've spent much time thinking about that. Sometimes we don't even know the voices that influence us because it happened, a long time ago, and it's still kind of speaking into us. It's not playing like a recording anymore, but it's kind of impacted the way that we live our lives and the things that we think about, the way we spend our time, our perspectives on life. But so often there are voices that speak into us that encourage us on what to do next in life, where we should go, if we should get married, if we should have kids, how we're going to raise our kids, what kind of work ethic we're going to have. Voices that are kind of a step further along. They impact our decisions, our lives. Sometimes it's a coach, sometimes it's a teacher, sometimes it's a parent or grandparent, a sibling, a friend. Peers. There are all kinds of voices that influence us. And the question is, which voices do you allow to influence you? I don't know if you've thought about that before. It's an important thing to think about. In fact, there are a couple things that we could say about the voices that we choose to allow to influence us. Oftentimes we allow voices of those who we look up to influence us, the voices of those we admire. Sometimes there's somebody who's a step further along in life, like we want to have kids someday and they have kids, or we want to have grandkids someday, they have grandkids, we want to be retired someday, they're retired, and so we look at the voices of those that we admire. Sometimes it's a personality. You may not even know the person. It's just somebody you watch on television or somebody you watch on the internet or YouTube or somebody whose voice you read about and you pay attention to. But oftentimes there are voices that we admire and we listen to those voices. We also listen to the voices of those who understand us. Right? There are people in our lives who seemingly understand what it's like to go through what we're going through. That's why in our government we have representatives that we sent to government to supposedly represent us because we believe they know, what it's like to live a day in our shoes. I was thinking about the school shootings that have taken place, and suddenly there are some students of prominence who have kind of moved to the forefront, who are the voices for a generation of students who feel like, hey, you know what it's like to go through what we're going through. And so we allow those types of voices to influence who we are. And then the third group, and this is not meant to be an exhaustive list, but it's an important list, I think, is that we listen to the voices of those who accept us. We listen to the voices of those who accept us. In fact, as people, we're kind of acceptance magnets, right? We like environments. We gravitate to environments of acceptance. When somebody accepts us, we want to be around that sort of person. And likewise, when somebody doesn't accept us, we're repelled by those sorts of environments. If there's an environment where somebody's expecting you to live up to a certain expectation, to talk a certain way, to look a certain way, dress a certain way, behave a certain way, and you're not doing it, and their approval of you is kind of dependent on your performance or your behavior, what do? You rebel against that. In fact, if you're new with us and maybe you had a different church experience at a different church where there were kind of some rules that you had to live up to and you had to talk and look and dress and act a certain way, and then you wouldn't be accepted unless you did that, then the response is often either we change our behavior or we leave, and more often than not, we leave. We want to go to environments where we are accepted, which frankly is what made Jesus such a popular person to be around, because Jesus accepted people in ways that the other religious people did not. Jesus welcomed them in. He was willing to share meals with people who did not believe what he believed and did not act the way he thought they should act. And yet in those moments, he had an opportunity to influence them. That's what made Jesus' ministry so powerful. He influenced people because he accepted and loved them for who they were. He invited them to a different place, but he accepted them exactly where they were. And so young people, you need to pay really close attention to that, because the reason your parents get concerned sometimes about the group of people you spend your time around is not because they're down on fun, and it's not because they don't want you to have friends. It's because they understand this principle, that those who accept us influence us. And they have something that you don't necessarily have right now, and that is perspective. They have perspective. They have perspective on the world. They have perspective on relationships. Not because they're better than you, they've spent a little more time in life, and they've had an opportunity to gain perspective. They've had an opportunity to live life a little bit and see the world a little bit and gain a different point of view. The more time you have, the more perspective you gain, and perspective is what makes all the difference. Because, as I said earlier, the greatest regrets we have as people often involve a group of people surrounding us, often a group of peers who lead us to make decisions that we would not otherwise make on our own, but who influence us in a very significant way. So today, we're going to talk a little bit more about that. And I want to take a look at a story that's from the Old Testament. If you've got your Bible, you may want to open it up. We're going to be in the book of 1 Kings, chapter 12. Now, we're going to look at one of the kings of the nation of Israel. We've been talking about a particular king over the last couple of weeks. His name was David. David was actually the second king of the nation of Israel. And the first king was a man named Saul. But Saul, he was mortally wounded in battle. He ended up falling on his sword, and his son Jonathan was also killed in battle. And so suddenly there was a void in the throne, and David had been anointed to be king by the prophet Samuel. And what's interesting, and you may not know this, is that at this point in time, Israel was really kind of two different territories. In fact, I've got a map here. We're going to stick the map up for those of you who love maps. There was the southern region of Israel, which was referred to as Judah. That's the purple section of the map. And then there's the northern region of Israel, which was the green section. And so David was immediately recognized as king in the southern region in Judah of Israel. But people in the north, it was like they're driving around their chariots with bumper stickers that say, David, not my king, you know. We kind of done that in our country. Obama, not my president, or Trump, not my president, right? Whichever side, it doesn't matter. You know, we get that kind of mentality and that divisiveness. And so over time, they eventually, after 7 years of fighting and strife, David was welcomed to be the king over both areas of Israel, but they kind of stayed separate areas. So David had a son, and he became the third king of Israel. Does anybody know who David's son was who became the third king? Solomon. I saw one person mouth the name Solomon, okay? Solomon became the third king of Israel, and Solomon brought in this golden age for the nation of Israel. It was like a time where there was so much gold in the nation, silver was considered to be worthless, if you can only imagine. So Solomon brought in this golden age, but he lived in the south. And in the middle of all the prosperity, Solomon had to build a palace for himself. He built a new temple for the Lord. He had 700 wives and 300 concubines. I'll let you think on that on your own. And they needed houses. They needed places to live. And so he built massive homes and lots of homes for all of his wives and concubines. And so you can only imagine all the conscripted labor that was required to make all of this work out. And then additionally, a lot of the labor came from the north. And so people were serving Solomon in the south. From the north, they were coming and serving Solomon. There was also a king. His name was Hiram, and he was king of the region of Tyre, which you can kind of see there in the green on the left, the very top of the green on the left. It's a small little dot on there. And so the king of Tyre, Hiram, he sent workers, he sent supplies, and Solomon had to pay for it. And so he had this great idea that he would pay for it by giving Hiram of Tyre some of the cities from the north. It would be like if Canada was helping us with something and we decided to give them Michigan as payment, right? I mean, the rest of us are like, who cares about Michigan? But the people in Michigan were really upset about it, right? I mean, they were frustrated. And so the people of the north, they were irritated. They were annoyed with Solomon's policies. In fact, there was a man, Jeroboam, who served in Solomon's kingdom and served Solomon, and over time he got frustrated because he was from the north. He got frustrated with Solomon's policies, and he began rebelling against Solomon. He had to flee to Egypt to save his life. And so when Solomon finally died, his son, Rehoboam, was ready to take the throne. But the people from the north were like, I don't know if we want this again, right? I'm not sure that we're going to welcome him as our king, not our king yet. And so that's kind of where we pick up the story, is the whole process of Rehoboam potentially becoming king of the entire nation of Israel. So 1 Kings chapter 12, beginning in verse 3, says this. It says, so they, and that's referring to the people of the north, so they sent for Jeroboam, and he and the whole assembly of Israel went to Rehoboam and said to him, your father put a heavy yoke on us, but now lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you. Now, this, I think, is actually pretty generous. The people from the north are like, look, your dad, he had some difficult policies. He worked us into the ground, and frankly, we can't do another 40 years of that. So if you'll listen to us, if you'll pay attention, if you'll lighten the load, we will welcome you as our king. Verse 5, Rehoboam answered, go away for 3 days and then come back to me. So the people went away. And Rehoboam had this big decision to make, and the question was, how would he decide what to do? Who would he allow to influence him? What voices would he listen to? Verse 6, then King Rehoboam consulted the elders. Now, depending on your translation of Scripture, it might say old men, because it was the old guys. I mean, it's like the old guys, the ones the writer of 1 Kings tells us, consulted the elders who had served his father Solomon during his lifetime. How would you advise me to answer these people? He asked. See, Solomon had reigned for about 40 years, and so many of these guys had probably even been with Solomon for that entire 40 years. And so they're the ones who were seasoned, that might be a nice way of saying it. So how would you seasoned old men, recommend that I respond to these people? So they replied, verse 7, if today you will be a servant of these people and serve them, which is kind of funny because that's what a servant is, right? One who serves. If you will be a servant of these people and serve them and give them a favorable answer, they will always be your servants. Now, I think this is absolutely fascinating advice. And the reason why it's fascinating is because essentially what the guys say is, look, Rehoboam, if you'll have a healthy dose of humility, which, by the way, is not anything that marked your father's administration, but if you're willing to have a healthy dose of humility and listen to these people and actually serve them, which means look out for their needs, do what you can to benefit and bless them, if you're willing to do that, you'll have a whole group of fans in your kingdom, people who will be willing to serve you. See, they had perspective on Solomon's life. They had seen what 40 years of Solomon had done to the people of the north, and so they gave this incredibly wise advice. And what's so fascinating about this advice, we can even think about it in today's terms. The idea of a leader, the idea of somebody who's in power, using his or her power to the benefit of other people is so vastly different than everybody around them. In fact, it was 1,000 years later, they were light years ahead of their time, because it was 1,000 years later that Jesus would step onto the scene, and Jesus would make this the hallmark, the cornerstone of his life, that he would live his life for the benefit of serving and looking to the needs of other people. And then he would say, those are your marching orders, you who are followers of me. I invite you to walk in my footsteps and put the needs of others before the needs of yourself. It was remarkable. This instruction that the old men gave to Rehoboam was about the best advice that they could have possibly given. The problem is, it's not particularly enticing advice, is it? You think about times when you finally get power, when you finally get to be in control, when you finally get to drive the car, when you finally get to make decisions on your own. You don't want to be told, look to the needs of other people. It's about me. It's about me. It's about me. And that's what Rehoboam was thinking about. He had seen his father be served by so many people. As the king, people feeding him grapes, fanning him, building his massive buildings for him while he lives a life of luxury. So there is very little enticing about this advice. And again, just if we're honest with ourselves, it would be easy to say, I'm not sure there's a lot that's enticing about this advice for us either. Which is why we enjoy shows like Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. Remember that one in the 80s, 90s? I grew up watching that with Robin Leach. And then there was Keeping Up with the Kardashians. That's the one people like to watch today. As we look at the lifestyles of those who are so much wealthier, who just get to enjoy the life of luxury. And so for Rehoboam, as he's hearing this advice, he's not thinking about looking to the needs of others. He's thinking about looking to the needs of himself. But the problem with that is, and you and I know that, is that a life that's lived for the sake of itself is not a very big life, right? You're just smaller and smaller and smaller. Which is why when we look at people like Mother Teresa and Billy Graham, when they die, people are lined up. They're looked at as heroes as they gave their lives away. People are lined up for their funerals. But then when a Bernie Madoff or a Harvey Weinstein goes down in flames, what do? We celebrate because he was a villain. And yet he was doing the very thing that so many of us believe our lives should be for, benefiting ourselves. And so it was such wise advice that was given by these old guys. But unfortunately, it was disregarded. Verse 8, we read, but Rehoboam rejected the advice the elders gave him. He didn't like it. It wasn't the glorious life he was looking forward to. It wasn't the glorious life he had seen his father live. So he rejected it, and he consulted the young men who had grown up with him and who were serving him. And he asked them, what is your advice? They said this, I think this is fascinating. He said, how should we answer these people who say to me, lighten the yoke your father put on us? See, when he went to the old guys, he said, how would you advise me? And then when he talked to the young guys, it's like, how should we respond? It's almost like this is our time now. This is our time. I don't know if you remember the movie The Goonies. Any of you have seen the movie The Goonies? I mean, there's this scene where a bucket's dropped down and the boys who are running away, and girls too, they could get out. They could ride the bucket and go up to the top. And all of a sudden in those moments, there's this big speech about, they did what's right for them. They lived in their time. That was their time. But this is our time. If we ride this bucket up, we're going to be back in their time, and they're controlling us. But now it's our chance. We got the keys to the car. We get to drive. We get to do whatever it is that we want to do in these moments. It's like in these moments, the guys are like, we're sick of being told what to do. We're sick of doing what the old guys want us to do and running things the way they want us to run things. We get to decide. Now, again, you young people in the room, I know this because I was young once. I'm still kind of young. We have those moments where we feel that way. And you may think to yourself, this is unique to you. But I'm telling you that even your parents felt the way you feel when they were your age. It's our time now. We get to decide. We're tired of the old people telling us what to do. Life is this blank slate, and we can do whatever we want. And I'm just telling you, you're unique just like everybody else, okay? You're unique just like everybody else because everyone else has felt the exact same thing. The difference is that as people grow older, they gain something that you just can't have when you're young. It's perspective and a bigger view and a bigger understanding of the world. And it's not because you're bad, it's not because you're wrong or evil or anything like that. It's not because they're better than you. It's just that they have time. They have time, and time gives a person perspective. These young men, they had no perspective. And so here's what they advised Rehoboam to do. The young men who had grown up with him, verse 10, replied, these people have said to you, your father put a heavy yoke on us, but make our yoke lighter. Now tell them, my little finger is thicker than my father's waist, which was saying something because Solomon was probably a very fat man, back in a time period where he didn't have to work and people are waiting on him hand and foot. It's like, how big my dad's waist is? My thumb. Rehoboam, tell him, my thumb is bigger than my dad's big fat waist. He goes on, he says, my father laid on you a heavy yoke. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions. And so what the friends tell Rehoboam is, look, you just need to gather these people together and say, you think it was bad under my dad? You ain't seen nothing yet. Because my thumb's bigger than his big fat waist, and I'll tell you what, I don't use whips, I use scorpions, which was a whip with little metal barbs at the end that was meant to inflict maximum pain and suffering. It's like, guys, buckle up because it's going to get real bad. You just need to tell them that, Rehoboam. You need to tell them that. And you need to lord your authority over them. Now we've got a little perspective 3,000 years later, and we have the opportunity to know what happens in those kingdoms where a leader lords authority over other people. We call those not kingdoms, we call them dictatorships. And that's why places like North Korea and Cuba and Venezuela don't have an illegal immigration problem, right? Nobody's flocking to get into those countries. In other words, actually they're trying to get out. Why? Because the leader lives for the sake of the leader, for the benefit of himself. He spends his energy and his authority and power serving himself. But the young men, they didn't see it. It was just their time. It was their time. So the question is, which voice should Rehoboam listen to? Maybe a bigger question is, which voice are you going to listen to? In those moments where you have to make decisions and you have to decide how you're going to live your life, which voices are you going to allow to influence you? Will you simply listen to the voices of your peers, or will you listen to a different voice? Verse 13, the king answered the people harshly. 3 days later, he went and talked to them, answered them harshly. Rejecting the advice given to him by the elders, he followed the advice of the young men and said, "My father made your yoke easy. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions." And his decision, it was a fulfillment of prophecy that had been made against the nation for David's sin with Bathsheba years and years before, that the nation would break apart. But it also sealed the fate of the people, and there was backlash. There was backlash that Rehoboam was not anticipating because he thought he had all the power, that it was all for him. Verse 16, when all Israel saw that the king refused to listen to them, they answered the king, "What share do we have in David? What part in Jesse's son? To your tents, Israel. Look after your own house, David." In other words, we don't want anything to do with David and his dynasty. We're going to live life on our own. We'll find our own king. So the Israelites went home. But as for the Israelites who were living in the towns of Judah, Rehoboam still ruled over them. And in that moment, the kingdom was permanently split. And Rehoboam, who could have led over a united Israel, lost the privilege and the opportunity to do it. All because of the voices. All because of the voices that he listened to and the voices that he allowed to influence him. So the lesson is so very important. The lesson is so very important. Be careful about the voices you allow to influence you. In fact, the truth is, voices with less perspective have the power to steer our lives in the wrong direction. Because they don't have perspective. Again, there's nothing wrong with them. It's just that they don't have the value of time. They don't have the opportunity to see a little more of life and to understand that decisions have consequences and that life is connected and one thing connects to the other. And it's not intentionally bad advice. It's just limited perspective. I know sometimes when you're in a younger generation, you can look at an older generation and say, "You're antiquated, you're out of date, you don't understand what this world is about. It was so long ago that you were in middle school, so long ago you were in high school, so long ago that you were having kids, or trying to figure out where to live your life and what to do after high school or college." I mean, you just don't know. But the thing is, those voices could save you from a significant amount of regret. Because your temptation is to believe the world's such a totally different place, but the truth is the world's really not that different. The world's really not that different. Sure, the stories are different and the people are different, but we all want to be happy. I mean, that's not new. We all want to know what our purpose in life is. That's not new. We all have the greatest fear and the greatest need, which is being known by other people. That's not new. We all want to understand faith and what our purpose is on life. That's not new. Which is why we can open up a book that was written 2,000 plus years later, a collection of documents written 2,000 plus years later, and it's still relevant and applicable to us because the world really hasn't changed that much. And so you would be wise to enlarge your circle of influence and include those from a different generation, because they may just have some important things that you need to hear. But here's the thing, it doesn't just apply to a younger generation, because I think there's a lesson for older generations as well, and that lesson is that voices with less perspective can see a reality that voices with more perspective can't. It shouldn't be ignored. It's like this. I was trying to think of the most simple way to kind of say that, and the most simple way I think is actually kind of a word picture. When you think about riding an airplane, if you've ever been on an airplane before and you're taxiing down the runway and you can see all the different signs with numbers and letters, different whatever runway number it is and other instructions, and you see lights flashing, and you can see it all so clearly. And then when you take off and you start to go up, you gain some perspective, don't you? But you can't see the minutia. You can't see the little detail anymore. There are things on the ground that are no longer in view. They're no longer clear, but you can see a bigger picture. And one of the temptations, I think, as we kind of move on in time, as we get a bigger picture of the world, is we forget what it's like to be right there on the ground. We forget some of the minutia. And I actually think that the older I get, personally speaking, and so I have to believe it's probably true for many others, that the older I get, the more intentional I have to be to understand younger generations. Because it's been a long time since I was in middle school. It's been a long time since I was in high school. It's been a long time since I was in college. And so I have to intentionally try to understand. And if I don't spend the time intentionally trying to understand, I won't. And the truth is, I think sometimes the reason the voices of a younger generation have shut off the voices of an older generation is because the older generation has said, we're driving the car, it's our car. No, don't touch the steering wheel. You'll get a chance. And then when we finally hand it over, we just say, all right, I'm done. I get out of the car. You do it on your own. And we let them kind of drive on their own without any kind of help or any kind of guidance, and we just set them off. Rather than sitting in the passenger seat and say, let me teach you how to drive. Let me teach you the nuances of the car and how to operate in traffic. But instead, we kind of say, nope, it's my keys, my car. You can have it one day. And then finally, when we hand it over, we just abdicate any kind of leadership or authority or any kind of help that we're going to offer them in the process. I think sometimes the reason young people don't listen to the voices of older is because they've been discounted and ignored. And so it's important to remember, if you're from an older generation, to pay attention and listen to the voices of a younger one. See what this really all comes down to? It's, again, the very key. It's the very thing that the elders tried to instill into Rehoboam as he was making the decision. It's the foundation of Jesus' life, and that is humility. It's humility. Will I be willing to listen to voices who see the world through a different lens? Perhaps with more perspective, perhaps with more detail. Will I be willing to pause and try and understand? I was thinking about my own life in all this, and growing up, I had a mom who loved to save wrapping paper. Anybody experienced that before? I mean, you know, whether it was a birthday or Christmas, especially if it was fancy wrapping paper. I mean, she would so delicately open the package, trying not to tear the tape. And I'm looking at it, I'm like, Mom, what is wrong with you? I mean, this wrapping paper has creases in it. You're not going to reuse that wrapping paper. See, from her point of view, she grew up with two parents who survived the Depression at a time where there was not a lot of stuff. And so you saved everything because you weren't guaranteed that you would have it in the future. Now, from my point of view, we had a drawer where all of our wrapping paper was kept, and there were 12 rolls in the drawer. And I'm thinking to myself, you do not need to save this wrapping paper because you're never going to use it. Now, here's the thing. We could have learned something from each other, couldn't we? Because my generation is a generation of waste. It's a generation of consume, 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 consume. Because that's what we're supposed to do in a capitalist culture, right? We consume. That's what makes the wheels turn. That's what makes the world go around. She had a lot to teach me about conservation and valuing what it is that we have and not taking that for granted. And she had some important lessons she could learn about hoarding and not being a hoarder. No, I'm just kidding. She's really not. The point is, we could learn from each other. We could learn from each other, but that requires humility. You know, we live in a world that values me above we, don't we? Pay attention to me, give me a platform, let me stand in front. I want you to listen to me, which is not humility, that's arrogance. Humility says, help me to understand you. Help me to look at the world through your lens and to understand the way that you see things. And so what if in this conversation of voices, you could enlarge your circle of influence to include those who see the world through a different lens? How would that change the way you see the world? In fact, I think we could kind of summarize it like this. Before you reject the voice of a different generation, have the humility to try to understand it. Before you reject the voice of a different generation. You young people, before you reject the voice of your parents, because I know they're dumber than dirt right now, but when you graduate and kind of go off in life, you'll discover that they actually do know something. They somehow survived and were able to do it for a lot of years, okay? And you from an older generation, have the humility to learn that you could learn something about technology and the way that the world is working right now and the way technology plays into that. Over the last couple of weeks, I've had the opportunity to talk with people from different generations and have conversations about this topic because I wanted their feedback and I wanted to hear. And one of the things I heard from the older generation is, I asked them the question, what questions do you wish a younger generation would ask you? And what I heard was, I wish they'd ask me how to raise my kids, or some parenting wisdom. I wish they'd ask me that now that I'm toward the end of my life, what mattered most in life? I wish they'd ask me, how do I instill faith into my family? And what things have you learned about growing? What have you learned about what matters most? And then I talked to people from a younger generation. And people from a younger generation, I said to, what do you wish people from an older generation would ask you? Their response was, we don't necessarily wish they would ask us anything. We wish that they would take the time to value us. Because so often, I think in our culture, we talk about millennials and we have kind of the stigma against millennials. They said, we don't necessarily fall into that stereotype. And yet we're written off and they don't take the time to actually know who we are and to know what we value and to understand why we have this tattoo or this piercing or why we've dyed our hair this certain color. I wish they would take the time to want to have a relationship. That was powerful. And I just got to thinking, what if we as a church body, as a community, we began valuing each other and trying to see the world through one another's lens? What a different place. What a different place we would be in. So in light of that, in honor of school ending soon, I'm going to give you a little bit of homework, okay? So for those of you who are tired of homework, this is more fun homework. But as you go today, we have a Voices card. And on one side it says, for the older generation. The other side says, for the younger generation. If you're someone like me who's kind of sandwiched between, you can use either side of the card or both sides. And my homework to you is this, it's to find somebody from a different generation and to have a conversation. Take them out to coffee, take them out to breakfast or lunch. You know, if you're from an older generation, pay for them, you know, because they don't have any money. Actually, a lot of them seem to have a lot of money, and I don't know where it comes from. But anyway, treat them to a lunch or a coffee and just talk. And try to understand and hear each other and see what you may learn, because you may just discover that when we walk in the footsteps of Jesus, when we live our lives with humility, there's a lot we can learn and a lot of ways that we can grow. And it's in that place that God works in us to form us and shape us into the people he wants us to be, and we could possibly even avoid a lifetime of hurt and regret because we were willing to listen to somebody who had walked before us. So, that's your homework. Grab one on your way out, and then today also in honor of Memorial Day, we have a special treat for you on your way out. Make sure you grab both of those things. But let me pray for us as we close our time together today. I guess the band's going to come up here in a minute as well. God, thanks so much for this time. Thank you for the story that's been preserved for 3,000 years, and as painful as it is to see the decision that Rehoboam made and know the consequences that are associated with it, God, the truth is we can learn from it. We can learn from it, and I hope we do. I hope that we'll have the wisdom to listen to the voices of different generations who see things through a different lens and begin to understand and to grow. God, would you give each one of us the humility we need to listen? Lord, thank you for the voices that you've placed in our lives. Thank you for the people who influence us. Would we make good decisions about those we allow to have an influence in us? Lord, thank you for this time. Give each one of us the wisdom we need to know what to do with what we've heard today, and then give us the courage to do it. Give us the courage to have a conversation, and in doing so, to draw near to you. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.